Let's review some key takeaways from week 3, which examined major pre-contact cultures and civilizations of the Americas. We will start with the Olmec culture. Archaeologists and historians do not know exactly where the Olmec first came from. They settled in the lowlands region of Mexico's southern Gulf Coast. The term Olmec comes from a Nahuatl or Aztec word meaning rubber people. The Aztecs, who spoke a Nahuatl language, came much later than the Olmec, and this is the term they referred to the Olmec by. The Olmec reigned from about 1400 BCE to about 400 BCE. In the Olmec heartland, 3 major cities emerged: San Lorenzo, which had its heyday from about 1400 BCE to 900 BCE, La Venta, from about 900 BCE to about 400 BCE, and Tres Zapotes from about 800 BCE to 400 BCE. The major Olmec cities rose along a network of rivers, as you can see on this map. This assisted the transportation of goods and materials in the region and facilitated trade. The Mesoamerican ball game was likely invented by the Olmec. They played the game both for sport and for religious reasons. The rules of the game seem to have varied widely across cultures and time periods, but in some versions, losing a game might mean you would be sacrificed. The game featured a solid rubber ball, which might weigh anywhere from between 4 and 10 pounds. It has been played since at least 1400 BCE by peoples of the historic Mesoamerican culture region. The Olmec developed distinctive art forms. Olmec artists used a wide variety of media, including jade, clay, basalt, and greenstone. Most Olmec art is quite realistic in its portrayal of humans and landscapes. The so-called Colossal Heads were perhaps the most famous art form the Olmec created. They were once thought to be players of the Mesoamerican ball game, or represent the players. Now it's generally accepted that the heads are portraits of rulers, perhaps dressed as ball players. No 2 heads are alike, and the helmet-like headdresses have distinctive elements, suggesting personal or group symbols. The weir jaguar was a religious symbol important to the Olmec. The creature appears to be half human, half jaguar. Some researchers equate this figure with the Olmec rain deity, but there's no consensus on its purpose. The weir jaguar also shows up in later Mesoamerican cultures. One archaeological project and find shows a bird, speech scrolls, and symbols somewhat like later Maya hieroglyphs. Another find, known as the Cascajal block, shows a set of 62 symbols carved on serpentine block. Many archaeologists consider Olmec creations to be the earliest pre-Columbian form of writing in the Americas. A few scholars, though, are skeptical and deny that this represents writing. The Mesoamerican long count calendar was likely invented by the Olmec. It is a non-repeating astronomical calendar, and its purpose is to track longer periods of time. It is used by many later Mesoamerican civilizations and also used by present-day conspiracy theorists who claimed that 2012 was going to be the end of the world, according to their interpretation of the long count calendar. This video is being recorded in 2019, so I'm assuming that the end of the world did not occur. Let's shift gears now and consider the origins of the Maya people and culture. Maya occupation at the city of Cuello in modern-day Belize has been radiocarbon dated to about 2600 BCE. The first sedentary communities in the Maya regions emerged about 2000 BCE. Settlements were established as early as 1800 BCE along the Pacific coast, and between 2000 BCE and 200 CE, small villages began to grow and then form cities. Maya civilization, as you can see on this map, developed in an area of southern Mesoamerica. It encompassed parts of modern-day Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Maya Classic period was noted for elevated monuments with dates that used the long count calendar. This was the peak of large-scale construction and city growth for the Maya. They recorded inscriptions on monuments, and this was a time of significant intellectual and artistic development. The largest cities had populations of up to 120,000 people that were linked to trade networks with smaller cities and villages. Chichen Itza was a powerful city-state and one of the largest Maya cities. It may have had the most diverse population in the Maya region due to its role as a center of trade and political power. This diversity in population was a factor in the emergence of a variety of architectural styles found at the site. The Maya political system revolved around the concept of a divine king who acted as mediator between humans and the gods. Power would normally pass to the eldest son of a king. Kings were expected to be successful in warfare, and those who were not were believed to have lost favor with the gods. Maya government was not bureaucratic in nature, and government officials were sponsored by higher-ranking members of the aristocracy. Officials referred to being owned by sponsors. And again, this is based on the city-state concept rather than an overarching king of all the Maya. There would be individual kings in the major city-states. The Maya believed in many gods. We use the term polytheistic to describe such a religious tradition. Some gods possessed greater power and influence than others. Gods could rise or fall in power over time. The Maya did not believe in two levels of heaven and hell as in the Judeo-Christian tradition. They believed in an upper world, a middle world, and an underworld, and each of these worlds was made up of additional sublevels. The Maya had a complex writing system that was the most advanced in the Americas prior to the arrival of the Europeans. The Maya recorded history and knowledge in books. Only 3 known examples remain, as the remaining Maya texts were largely destroyed by the Spanish after conquest. This was part of efforts to convert the Maya to Christianity. Also, there are examples of Maya texts surviving on monuments and on pottery, such as in the image on this slide. The Maya developed a very complex system of mathematics. They were one of the earliest peoples to develop the concept of zero. They used a base 20 number system in counting. For comparison, the base 10 system is in wide use today is due to the spread of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system. Next, let's review some important points from our readings on the Aztec and Inca empires. As you can see on this map, the Aztec Empire encompassed much of present-day central and southern Mexico, plus parts of Central America. This was a highly fertile region capable of producing great agricultural harvests. The term Aztec, by the way, was coined by Europeans much later, and the rulers and subjects of the Aztec Empire would not have used this word. The ethnic group leading the Aztec Empire were the Mexica. Nahuatl was the language group spoken by the Mexica and other ethnic groups in the Aztec Empire. Increasingly, in the last decades of the Aztec Empire, important government positions were held by persons of Mexica ancestry. The Mexica believed that they came from a legendary place called Aztlan, somewhere north of the Valley of Mexico. They founded the city of Tenochtitlan in 1325 CE on a small island in Lake Texcoco, which you can see on this map. Tenochtitlan became the dominant altepetl, or city-state, in the region. The Mexica then formed the Triple Alliance with the city-states of Texcoco and Tlacopan. This became the Aztec Empire, and eventually Tenochtitlan was the dominant power of the Triple Alliance. This chart shows the basic Aztec political structure. The Mexica king ruled over Tenochtitlan, and tribute was paid upward by other city-states to the Mexica king. The basic unit in this power structure was the Calpulli, which translates roughly as ward or neighborhood. So Calpulli inhabitants were collectively responsible for managing political and religious structures, as well as paying tribute to the larger altepetl, which then kicked up to the Mexica. The altepetl was the highest Aztec political unit that maintained some autonomy. The word altepetl literally means water mountain, and it refers to the concept of a mountain providing water that nourishes the people below. In practical use, it's somewhat like the English term city-state. As mentioned earlier, Tenochtitlan was the largest altepetl in the Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan was the Aztec capital city. It contained hundreds of thousands of people at its peak. This was the main political and economic base of the Mexica, and the Aztecs used its beauty and splendor to reinforce their position as the center of power in the region. Ruling each altepetl was a person known as the Tlatoani. This is a Nahuatl word that literally means he who speaks, but it translates, roughly as ruler or king. The Tlatoani was chosen by 4 electors and was the highest ranking person in an altepetl. The term Hue Tlatoani referred to the Aztec emperor, or the Great Tlatoani. This image shows the social hierarchy system of the Aztec Empire, with the Tlatoani at the top, enslaved persons at the bottom, and gives you a sense of how the Aztec leaders viewed the importance of various socioeconomic and demographic groups. The Mexica had a unique religious system, though they shared some gods with other peoples of the region. The most important Mexica god was Huitzilopochtli, whose name means hummingbird of the south. Huitzilopochtli was the Aztec god of war and the sun. He was fed human sacrifices regularly, as the Mexica believed sacrifices necessary to make the sun return. He had to be fed in order to provide the sun. The Mexica believed that Huitzilopochtli was the god that led them from the legendary Aztlan across the desert on a long journey that eventually led to their new capital of Tenochtitlan. The Mexica believed they would receive great wealth and prosperity if Huitzilopochtli was properly worshipped. Conversely, terrible fortunes awaited them if he was not properly worshipped. Tlaloc was the Aztec rain god, and he was very important to the Aztecs. Since harvests depended on rain, he was also the fertility god. Tlaloc had one of the largest temples in Tenochtitlan. The most important site of worship of the rain god was on top of Mount Tlaloc, a tall mountain on the eastern rim of the Valley of Mexico. Aztec rulers made periodic pilgrimages to Mount Tlaloc to ensure enough water would be provided for planting. Another important Aztec god was Quetzalcoatl, who was the feathered serpent god, and who could be found in many other Mesoamerican cultures. Some legends suggest that Moctezuma, the Aztec leader, may have believed that the arrival of the Europeans was equated with the return of Quetzalcoatl, or even further, that Hernan Cortez, who we'll talk about in the next module, was the personification of Quetzalcoatl. However, many scholars dispute this legend, arguing that it did not appear in any account until well after the Spanish conquest, and may have represented an attempt by Mexica to sort of tell the Europeans what they wanted to hear. So there's no convincing evidence that pre-conquest evidence that Moctezuma believed this. Finally, let's take a look at the Inca Empire, which dominated much of the continent of South America in the century before the arrival of the Europeans. This course is primarily a North American indigenous peoples course, but I like to include the Inca because it's important to recognize the variety of cultures and civilizations that were in the pre-contact Americas, and because their influence both pre-conquest and post-conquest was so extensive. Archaeological evidence indicates that the first settlements in the Cusco Valley date to about 4500 BCE. By about 900 CE, the Inca were a distinct tribe. The Cusco region became a significant center about 1000 CE. By 1200 CE, the Inca established a kingdom structure, and regional unification began in the late 14th century CE. By the early 15th century CE, the Inca began to expand, first to the south and then in all directions, up and down the western coast of South America. According to Inca tradition, Manco Capac was the first Inca ruler, but some historians regard him as mythical and may not have actually existed. The major rulers for which there is significant historical evidence to support their presence are listed on this particular slide, reigning from 1438 to 1471 CE. Pachacuti was the 9th Sapa Inca, and the leader who kicked off a lengthy period of imperial expansion. Tupac Inca Yupanqui, from 1471 to 93, continued the expansion started by his father, and Huayna Capac, 1493 to 1527, also helped expand the empire, and he was noted for significantly developing infrastructure, especially the Inca road network. The Sapa Inca, which we could equate with English words like king or even emperor, led the Inca Empire. The four main provinces of the empire formed what the Inca called Tawantinsuyu, or four corners. And these four corners met at Cusco in the center of those four colors that you see on this particular slide. Each level of government had 10 officials, and the highest levels of government were related to the Sapa Inca, or at least the holders of those offices. At the bottom of the government were locally recruited administrators who managed settlements and villages. The Inca had a polytheistic religious system. The religion of the Inca focused on controlling the natural world and avoiding such disasters as earthquakes, floods, and drought. Two of the most important deities were Inti, the sun god, and Mamakia, the moon goddess. Inca religious rituals involved ancestor worship. Sacrifices, both animal and human sacrifices, in some cases even children, were made to pacify and honor the gods and ensure the good health of the king. Machu Picchu is a major Inca archaeological site located high in the Andes Mountains of South America. The location was established because it made it difficult for enemies to reach. There were several purposes for Machu Picchu that we believe. The city served as a vacation site or a getaway place for the Sapa Inca, and it also operated as a religious shrine. Here is an aerial view of Machu Picchu, a vacation destination for many intrepid tourists in the 21st century, and a place that's on many folks' bucket lists. Ruling such a vast empire meant that the Inca needed a strong communication system. There were 25,000 miles of roads in the Inca road network. The roads were used to move armies, state officials, and goods. One of the most unique features of the system were people known as chasquis. These were message runners who could cover over 100 miles in a day. Government employees using the road system also made use of these rest stations along the way for the chasquis, which were known as tambos. The image on this slide shows an Inca road with stone walls that's still in use in the 21st century. These blocks fitted together so precisely that no mortar was needed, with an emphasis on clean lines and trapezoid shapes and the use of natural features in these buildings and structures. They have withstood many powerful earthquakes that frequently hit the region. Quipus were a string-based accounting system developed by the Inca. Knots were tied on lengths of string to represent data. Most scholars today believe the knots only represented numbers for things perhaps like tax collection or census data, though some scholars still hold that these might also represent words. And there have been some interesting efforts using computers in the last decade or two to try to see if these knots can be translated into bits and bytes, and if that data can be analyzed by a computer in a way that human interpretations have failed. But today, as of 2019, the surviving quipus are still undeciphered. This brings to a close our Week 3 review of major pre-contact American cultures and civilizations.